Everyone, welcome to the Tennis and Bagels podcast. This is your host Vanch, and joining me today is a very familiar guest. You guys know him as a Hall of Famer, historian, writer. We've had him on the show several times after all these majors. It's always a pleasure to have the great Steve Flink here with us today. So, hello, Steve.
Hey, Vanch. Good to be back with you again. And hard to believe we reached the end of another tennis season. They go too quickly.
Yes, they go way too quickly, and before we know it, United Cup will be back around the corner, and we'll be right after Christmas. We'll be headed to 2025 for tennis. But nonetheless, I just wanted to kind of bring you on here to talk about some of the best players this year, what we can look forward to next year for 2025, some new breakout players. We've got a fresh young crop coming in, born in the 2000s, and ultimately the question is, who else besides Sinner and Alcaraz is really going to emerge in a big way in these majors? And can Djokovic kind of revitalize himself after winning Olympic gold as well? So we'll talk about all of that. I guess let's talk about Sinner, because he finished the year super strong again, wins the ATP finals, loses the fewest number of games ever. So it was like one of the most dominant ATP finals runs in a long time. He didn't drop a single set as well. First time that's happened since 1986. And then he leads this country to yet another Davis Cup. But we also have the WADA appeal still incoming. So we don't know how long he will be banned for, if he does get banned next year. But there's all of that combined with the really dominant season that he had. So what are your thoughts on kind of all of that?
Well, I think your last point is worth touching on because it makes it all the more remarkable. If you look back on this spectacular season that he had, well, I guess 73-6, and I mean, he did all this, Vanch, at a time when he had this steroid case hanging over his head, at least for a good chunk of the year, when you consider that he was tested in Indian Wells in March, that he was notified in April. So he knew, and he was making his appeals and living with that internally, which was very difficult, I think, all the way up until just before the U.S. Open, the week before. They make the announcement, and they explain that they're taking away the Indian Wells points and the prize money from Indian Wells, and they've decided he personally wasn't responsible, but obviously had to pay some kind of price for what his physio and his trainer had done. And we don't need to go into all the particulars of all that, but obviously that was difficult enough. And he still goes out and wins the U.S. Open, by the way, right after that. But we had no idea that WADA was going to come back in and appeal. And now, as we sit here now, we're still waiting on the appeal. He's still waiting. How he's been able to compartmentalize so beautifully. I mean, I think that says a lot about his character, frankly, because I think in his mind, he knows. And my interpretation of that is that he knows he's innocent. That's my take on it. And therefore, he can sleep well at night. But he still has to worry about being judged this way. And I'm still amazed that WADA takes the stance that it should be a year to 2 years. I could see if their stance had been, he should have been suspended for, 6 weeks or some type of suspension, some length of time rather than just prize money and points from Indian Wells. But again, I think that should have happened far sooner. So that's the backdrop. He's been dealing with all that. But as you said, the fantastic year-end championships there. And then he gets right back up and wins the Davis Cup for the second year in a row for Italy, which he'd done almost as well with last year when he lost to Djokovic in the Turin finals and then led Italy to the Davis Cup. So I just feel like it's a fascinating situation, Vanch, because week in, week out, he was a far better player than Carlos this year. He's much more reliable, fully worthy, deserving of number one. He wins 2 majors. Carlos wins 2 majors. Sinner never loses before the quarters the whole year long. And, look, it's not like some of the Djokovic years where he won 3 majors or some of the Roger Federer 3 major years. I could go back. There's other years that have been greater than his, but all things considered, this was a first-rate campaign for him, which he built so well on the way he finished. As you know, Vanch, he had such a great end to 23, where he was sort of a different player post-U.S. Open, where he'd lost to Zverev, and he finished the year very strong. And he had those wins over Novak, those very big wins, especially the big wins in the round robin at Turin and in the Davis Cup finals from triple match point down. And he built on that because he gave us, there was a lot of encouragement to see him finish the year that well. And then you wondered, okay, how now is he ready for the slams? He still hadn't won a slam. So he makes the great comeback against Medvedev from 2 sets down in the Australian final. And then obviously he closes the Grand Slam season with the win at the US Open. In between, I have to wonder, maybe there was a brief period, maybe in between, maybe where he was a bit preoccupied with this case. Maybe that was the only time of the year. We'll never know. He had illnesses, injuries. There were things going on that we did know about that I think contributed to, some of the losses, but perhaps the Tsitsipas loss in Monte Carlo, perhaps the Carlos loss in Roland Garros. And he certainly didn't seem well. He was talking about dizzy spells during the Medvedev loss at Wimbledon. So during that period, that was the least productive and reliable Sinner. But that disappeared so quickly. And, he's back and he's winning Cincinnati and he's winning the Open and he's fantastic in the fall and he closes the year in style. So, look, I think he was an authentic number one. I think he reminds me more of Novak than he does of, say, Federer. Well, Carlos, maybe there's a little more Federer in Carlos, if I can put it that way, in that, the flamboyance, the shot making, but ups and downs. While I think Sinner is more like Novak in the sense that you kind of know he's going to reach a certain level in almost every single match. He's going to have a fighting chance. His level, maybe it doesn't rise quite as high as the very, very best Alcaraz, but it's close enough. And then his average level is a good deal higher, in my view, than Carlos's. So you add all that up, and boy, was he ever worthy to be number one? And did a great job to get his first 2 majors and Turin and the Davis Cup. That's a lot of accomplishments in 1 year. So I think let me put it this way: my fingers are crossed. The authorities have got to do what they've got to do. And I think the process has kind of been unfair to everyone, just like I think Swiatek, which we don't have to get into much now, I think that also is oddly handled, and we find out way after the fact. And I just believe that in Sinner's case, he was fighting this. He deserves a verdict soon, but we may have to wait until close to January before we're going to know, or before he's going to know. But let's put it this way, Vanch. If he's cleared, if the appeal if the appeal does not go through, if it's rejected, and he's able to, and his mind is clear, and he now knows he's fine from this point forward, I think he'll have another fantastic year in 2025. That's how I look at it. I look for him to do something along the lines of what he did this year, where he probably puts 2 majors into his pocket and wins a lot of other tournaments. And frankly, I expect him to stay at number one. So I tip my hat to him. I don't know if you agree with my thoughts on what he had to deal with internally, but I think that makes this year even more extraordinary when you weigh that in.
Yeah, absolutely. It just shows that he had like this steel-like composure, and he could compartmentalize in a way that's just very unique. It seemed like when he walked on the court that he had a safe space for a while. But you could clearly see also that it was affecting him in some of the losses, like the Wimbledon loss against Medvedev when he wasn't well and hadn't slept much in the days before, and the Tsitsipas loss as well, and the Carlos one. Like, it does put into perspective that dry spell that he had in between, but also just, like how well, like you said, he did afterwards. Let me ask you, what do you think specifically in his game, you feel like he added that impressed you the most? Because we saw a lot of these things kind of culminate in the fall last year with the serve and the comfortable movement in the corners, like the explosiveness when he's pushed wide, and his ability to kind of defend in an aggressive way, and the ball striking is just so much cleaner. He's missing a lot less from attacking positions. But do you feel like he's also added, like the forehand drop shot, I felt like was huge in that final against Fritz, and especially in different moments, I feel like he's improved his net game as well, and there's no discernible weakness.
There's not much for me to add to what you said. I'm in complete accord. I feel like the serve improvement, most of it happened at the end of 23, but maybe he became 5 to 7% better on the serve over the course of his life. It's so hard to break him now. And when he is down break point, he's as good as anybody at working his way out of that and making the other guy beat him. He's not going to give it away in that situation. So toughest guy to break in the game right now. I used to think, I remember like even watching him playing Novak in the 23 Wimbledon semis when he lost in straight. And I felt like the forehand at that time, Novak could probe and get errors off the running forehand of Sinner, which doesn't happen much anymore. Backhand just gets better and better, subtle improvements. But you're right. He worked hard on the drop shot. It's going to get even better. It's not as natural as Carlos's drop shot. But it's important that he has that in his arsenal, that he keeps guys are expecting him to hit all those big shots all the time. And whenever he has time, they're always going to be anticipating another lethal drive. So to have the drop is very important. And that's a really good element that he's added. And the rest is pretty subtle. He just keeps getting discernibly better in every department of his game. That's how I look at it. But you got to the crucial areas beautifully in the way you assessed it. So it's pretty hard to beat. And I think now the goal for next year, as much as winning these majors, is to solve the dilemma of Carlos, because to lose all 3 matches against Carlos, it had to be disappointing, frustrating for him, because when you look back on those 3 matches, it starts with Indian Wells, where he wins the 6-1 first set. He's killing Carlos. And Carlos did a very nice job to turn it around on a court that he loves. Pretty slow, hard court. I get it. But still, Sinner kind of looked like he might have gotten a bit hurt during that match. A couple things happened that led me to believe he wasn't feeling that great physically. So it didn't stay that. The last 2 sets were fairly comfortable for Carlos. And then you go to Roland Garros, and Sinner's up 6-2, 2-love. I thought, wow, if he can tuck this set away, forget it. But nice job from Carlos to win the second. But Sinner does come back, takes the third, and he goes all the way to 4-5 in the fourth, serving at 40-15, and didn't close that game. And it was one overhead where he just, went down the line, and he kind of botched it. And I felt like if he could have gotten his way into a 4-set tiebreak, maybe he closes it out there and it didn't have to go 5. And then Carlos outplayed him in the 5th. So that was another frustrating one, because he's 2-1 up and pretty close to, and holding quite easily all through the 4th. So I felt like he was pretty comfortable at that stage of the match, and Carlos took it away from him deservedly. And then obviously their Beijing match was just a beauty. And that was comparable to the US Open of 2022 in my mind. It's a high level from both, and comes all the way down to that 3rd set breaker where Sinner is serving at 3-love up. You'd have to believe then it's his match, but he didn't win either point on his serve. In fact, he never won another point, period. Carlos swept 7 points in a row, and spectacular shot making. And it wasn't that Sinner maybe played one shaky point in there, one miss, but that was about it. The rest was brilliance from Carlos. But again, that's 3 matches where he's within striking distance. He's pretty close. He's winning the first sets in all of those matches. And as you know, Vanch, at this level, these guys, obviously Djokovic has the best record of anybody after winning the first set, the best front runner. But all of these guys, if you look at the stats, Novak's in the range of 96%. All these guys are somewhere high 80s into the 90s. They're almost unstoppable, whether it's best of 5 or best of 3. You give them the first set. So it's amazing to think that Carlos could 3 times come from a set down against Jannik and win all 3 of these matches in very different circumstances too. The slow, hard courts of Indian Wells to the clay of Roland Garros to the last one in Beijing, very different situations all around. So I just feel like that's it. That's what Sinner will want to remedy the most next year, and not in a vengeful way, but just in a professional way. Say, okay, I've got to solve this. I've got to, at the very least, hold my own with Carlos, but I'd like to beat him more than he beats me. That's got to be his attitude. And the thing that I find fascinating, Vance, is if you're looking at the way they perform day in, day out, week in, week out, you'd figure the odds would be in his favor to do that he would at the very least be splitting matches with Carlos. He'd have his days. It just didn't happen for him. Those losses were spread out, and he just wasn't able to get the job done on any of those occasions. And maybe a bit unlucky, for instance, not to play Carlos in Turin. that might have been the ideal time for Sinner to play Carlos, because Carlos is struggling in that event, and as it turned out, didn't make the semis, and that might have been perfect to play him there. Say that Carlos could have squeezed into the semis and Sinner plays him there. Maybe that would have worked out. But that, I think, will be his overriding goal for next year. And it also could make the difference between winning one slam or two slams or three. As it might be that he's got to get, maybe he and Carlos play another crucial match at one of those majors or more than one. So it's going to be important for him to assert himself in that rivalry. What are your thoughts on what Sinner has to do to turn that around? And because you saw all those matches and you know how well he played at the beginnings of all those matches.
Yeah, I did feel like in the Beijing match, I think that's the one that, I just felt like after watching that and, hearing what you said of Indian Wells and Roland Garros, which I also watched just as closely as you, I just feel like, in the Sinner of old, the one who was more erratic and who was missing more and who... Yeah. He had this head-to-head edge over Carlos, but he couldn't beat those other guys like Djokovic and Medvedev and Zverev and other players. But against Carlos, he would rush and he would be the one kind of, on the offensive. He'd be more in control of those matches, like from a tactical standpoint. But I felt like in Beijing, he kind of allowed Carlos to dictate a little bit too much, especially I think the level that Carlos had in the tiebreak when he won 7 points in a row. That was like
that was crazy.
That was like 12 out of 10.
Crazy.
Yeah, I don't think that's like repeatable. If you do that over and over, that's like, caught lightning in a bottle. That's like when Thiem did that to Djokovic in the ATP finals. There's like not much you can do there. But there were some moments I like he had a couple of break points to go up 5-3, and then maybe he wins that 6-3, and then we don't.
Yeah, right.
And then you're right about the fact that Carlos didn't get there enough times to face Jannik, like towards the end. Like, he loses to Mahach in Shanghai. He loses in the ATP finals to Ruud and Zverev, so he doesn't make it out of his group. And, Jannik's floor is a lot higher week in and week out right now. So that's where, from a Carlos standpoint, he has to be getting to the Jannik matches more. And from a Jannik standpoint, he has to be, trying to win one of these closer matches. Interestingly, in their rivalry, I feel like whoever's won the first set hasn't come away with the win most of the time.
Yeah, it's very odd, very strange. It's a good point you're making, and I feel like it's here he was coming into the year with a 4-3 lead head to head, and then leaving the year with a 4-6 record. But I got to believe that time is on his side, that he's going to get back in there. Not to say that Carlos isn't going to have his wins, he certainly will. But I've got to believe that next year, Sinner beats Carlos at least a couple of times. I mean, I think they're going to meet. My guess is they meet 5 or 6 times next year. I think 3 is too low a number for them. I see it being more, and I'm expecting that maybe Carlos plays more on the, with some luck he's not hurt during the clay court season, and Sinner's not hurt, so maybe they meet a bit more then. And maybe Carlos is finally able to solve his post-Wimbledon problem and play a little better after Wimbledon, whatever. I just think there's a chance that they meet more, and that if they were to meet 5 or 6 times, I would expect Sinner to at least get his 3 and get back in there. And maybe I'm rooting for that in the sense that I want this rivalry to thrive. I want to see it become something along the lines of what we saw with the big 3. But because these guys are going to be around for so long, that I want to feel like they keep pushing each other, and that the unpredictability is there, and that they each, maybe they each have stretches where they can pull off 2 or 3 wins against each other, but where the other guy strikes back. And I think that's what Sinner is looking to do next year. And you're right about those chances to go up 5-3 were very big for Sinner in Beijing, and that could have made all the difference. But look, he kind of salvaged the first set, which he easily could have lost, and set points down, and it was that kind of a match. But it was so typical of their skirmishes in the year that he had his openings, he had his chances. And I think maybe the reason that he lost Beijing was partially Indian Wells and Roland Garros combined. And in the back of your mind, you're saying, I don't want to lose to him. It's hard to get that out of your mind. And I know they would say they don't, and they're in the moment, but a part of Sinner had to be thinking, I don't want to lose this guy again. I got to get this one. This is mine. This win should belong to me. and maybe it made him a bit tight at times. But in the end, Carlos obviously was just too good in that breaker, and so be it. But I do expect that will be one of the primary motives, if I can put it that way, motivations for Sinner next year, is to win big matches against Carlos, because he's certainly not struggling again. There's nobody else. He pretty much owns Medvedev now, despite what happened at Wimbledon. And Fritz got all the way up to 4, and he cannot beat Sinner at this point. And then the question would be Novak, because Novak played so much better in Shanghai against Sinner than he did in Melbourne. I mean, we all wondered what was going on in the first 2 sets of that Australian semi, but it was much more the real Novak in the Shanghai match. It was a good high level, and that match was probably going to always be decided by who won the first set, which Sinner did in the tiebreak. So, I mean, I felt like Novak was right in there with him toe-to-toe, playing really well. And so that'll be interesting, because those are the only 2 meetings we got with Sinner and Djokovic this year, where there was a long ways apart. To go all the way from Melbourne to Shanghai was a long time waiting to see them play again. So I feel like that will be interesting. I do expect Djokovic to, I guess, we can talk about more. We can get to Novak in a bit, but I just feel like he'll be in there with those 2 guys. He will be in there. I'm convinced of that. That he will have his wins over the other 2, in my view.
Yeah, I see it the same way as you do, and it was fun seeing Federer and Alcaraz watching that match in Shanghai.
Yes.
Them, and that came to my mind as you were talking about the comparisons between Sinner and Djokovic and Federer and Alcaraz. It would have been very interesting to listen or somewhat get some insight into what they were thinking watching that final.
Yeah, and they were talking bunch. It's funny you point that out. I remember, and you saw them talking, and you saw Roger saying some stuff to Carlos, and you're just dying. I was just dying to have them mic'd up. Yeah. Would have been just great to hear what they were saying. But
absolutely,
I feel like things are shaping up for a pretty fascinating 25, all things considered, particularly when it comes to that trio. Particularly when it comes to, obviously, Carlos and Sinner are most likely vying for number 1, but Novak picking his spots, and Novak looking to get that 25th major and try to beat these guys when he can, where he can. And I feel like he's obviously extremely committed right now to be bringing in Murray as his coach. I think the most important part of that, the most significant thing about that, is that it tells everybody else how serious he is. You don't make a move like that. I mean, maybe he was conflicted a bit this past year, and there were times when he didn't feel motivated, and therefore he didn't zero in and find a real coach. He had people filling in, he had people on his team, but he didn't have the kind of coach that he really wanted, which was a big-time guy like he'd had with Goran. Mm-hmm. And he took a long while to sort through it, to sort it out and decide. And then I think in the end, he made a very wise, out-of-the-box Novak Djokovic decision, which shocked everybody, to go to Murray. But of course, what people forget is that they always were very respectful. It was fiercely competitive. I mean, we had 4 Australian finals won by Novak over Andy in their careers, and he beat him in a French final. And then Andy beat Novak in the finals of the U.S. and Wimbledon to counter. So 5-7 major finals is a lot, and tons of other important meetings. And I feel like the respect was there, and they understand each other very well, and they're born a week apart back in '87. And I in the end, it just made so much sense to me. And also, Andy understands Novak's temperament. They both are high strung out there. They both like to vent. So they'll have to figure that part out about how much, venting Novak's going to do with Andy sitting in the coach's box. But I think the most valuable, as you know, Vanch, there's only so much you can do in between points. If Novak is upset about something and they're in the middle of a big tense match and it's a set all and 3-all in the third, and he's looking over to Andy, Andy can only do so much in that 20-25 seconds to help him out. But where he's going to be invaluable is preparing. It's the pre-match. And I bet you Andy will pore over tapes, and he's also watched a lot of these matches. I know he's watched Novak and Carlos play Wimbledon finals. He he's pretty much on top of it already. But also, he just has that career-long perspective of knowing how Novak plays, knowing how Novak has evolved, what's changed about it from the younger Novak. He's observed it very, very closely. So I feel like it was the best possible choice he could make, and that will, I think, really pay off. I just feel like they're going to have some pretty high-level discussions leading up to these matches, and that he's going to spur Novak on, and I see it being a very successful partnership. And to me, the key to it all, of course, will be Novak, the knee. How close to 100% can he get that knee? He kept wearing that sleeve on the knee. It started at Wimbledon, and he kept using it. And obviously, it didn't prevent him from winning that Olympic gold. But even there, he had some issues with the knee when he played Tsitsipas in the quarters. And fortunately, it sorted itself out, and he played really well the last 2 rounds against Musetti and Alcaraz. But I feel like as long as that holds up, which I think it will, I think he took the time off that he needed. He didn't play Turin. He didn't play Paris or Turin, which I think was his way of saying, I'm better off to gear myself up for next year. And he wasn't obsessed with whether he finished 4 in the world or 7. And as it turned out, it was 7. He'll deal with that. But I feel like the partnership, I like the way it's shaping up. I feel like they'll have time to get ready for Australia together, and I feel like Murray will he really knows the mindset of Djokovic, and he knows his game inside out. That's the beauty of it. Knows it so well, and he'll like the idea of being on the same side of the net for a change, and being able to offer that kind of wise counsel. Yeah. How do you feel about the partnership?
I feel largely the same as you. I mean, also having freshly retired like 3 months ago, and having played a lot of those guys, not just Sinner and Alcaraz, but like guys like Alexei Popper that Andy beat in Queens, just before he essentially couldn't play anymore. But, and then also just, the perspective that he would have in terms of scouting would just be so fascinating to listen to. Like, just tactically, what are some new things that he can bring in against the likes of Sinner and Alcaraz, but more so just day in and day out. And like Andy is one of those players that just couldn't sit in retirement for more than 3 or 4 months, and he was just eager to get back out as soon as he could, and it's very, very exciting. I'm very fascinated by how it's going to work out with because with Goran in the box, Djokovic could really use that as an outlet in his way of venting and getting his frustration out, and Goran would take some of that heat and he would understand it. But with Andy, I wonder, since they're both very similar in how they do that, how that's going to look like, and if
they're going to have to talk that through, Vanch. I think I'm sure it's something that will come up ahead of time, and Novak even wanting to get Andy's feelings about that, in advance. But then part of it will be trial and error, just figuring it out as they go along. I got a feeling, Vanch, that Andy would probably be kind of thin-skinned about it, because it's how he operates. Mm-hmm. And he'll get it, and he'll. I also think there were times when Goran almost froze a bit, in the sense that he's thinking to himself, I only got 20 or 25 seconds. What do you want from me? And he would try to help, but I don't think it was his strength. I think his strength was pre-match, and I feel like he didn't ever quite figure out how to handle that so that he could be helpful in the moment. But Andy, I think, will be different. You can see Andy kind of looking him, staring him down a bit, but in a good way, and said, all right, hold on. This is what you got to do. Yeah. Start going down the line, serve him wide, whatever it's going to be. But his mind, he has a very kind of agile mind. Not that Goran doesn't, but I think Andy will think of something quickly to pass along, some quick piece of advice. Yeah. And I got a feeling they'll figure that out pretty quickly in the early stages of the Australian Open.
Yeah, this might be something very oddly specific, but I was also wondering if Novak will add a forehand drop shot to his game at some point. I feel like it could come in handy, and he can be good.
Yeah, it would. It's so rare for him. He loves it. He loves that backhand down the line drop, and it's true. He's very patterned that way, and that's how he likes to do it. And Andy might that's a subject Andy might bring up to him. But again, do you want do you want to mess with it now or not? I mean, they could test it out in practice. It's certainly worth trying to implement it, especially in the first, second round of the Australian.
Yeah.
And see if he can pick up some confidence in it. But you're right. It would be they never look, the players are so accustomed to Novak doing it off the backhand that some of them would be shocked, when suddenly a forehand drop shot down the line caught them in their tracks.
Absolutely, yeah. And I also do feel like in general, people are tending to kind of over-exaggerate how much Djokovic has actually declined this year, because you look at his record, right? It's 37-9. Still won over 80% of his matches. Couldn't play the rest of Roland Garros. Only played 10 tournaments all year. He still finishes number 7, and he gets the trophy that he wants. So that it really doesn't seem like it's the worst year, No,
I agree. He got hurt by that shock loss in Indian Wells, and the carryover onto the clay. Yeah. But you're right. Overall, and we're still looking at a semi in Australia. We're looking at the quarters of the French, and as you say, didn't even lose their finals of Wimbledon. I think the Poprin loss, that was disappointing. I think because he had come off the Olympic win, and he just didn't have it. The fire within wasn't quite there. I mean, he was trying to almost manufacture it. It just wasn't there. So that one, that certainly made a big difference to go out early at the Open when could have picked up a lot of points there. And then, as you say, the quality was there because then he took some time off and he had the good Shanghai and the finals and played well against Fritz in the semis, and then he calls it a year pretty much, and it just plays the EXO in Saudi Arabia. So you're right. The standard overall was really not that bad, and despite what happened to the knee, despite everything, despite the distractions. So, yeah, I don't think it's going to take that much for him to bring it up another notch. And still, you could see, despite a few of those surprise losses, like losing to Casper Ruud on the clay was a bit surprising, as good as he is. But I say it's still in his mind, and Andy's going to feel the same way. It's really still about zoning in on Alcaraz and Sinner.
Yeah.
And planning for those. Not that you can take the other guys for granted, but zoning in on them, and maybe to a much lesser extent, but still to be taken seriously, Zverev is plays Novak tough. So you don't want to ignore him, but it's largely about Alcaraz and Sinner. And I feel like Novak, by and large, despite Wimbledon was an exception, that it was the first 2 sets were so quick, and then he lost a tiebreaker in the third. He didn't give a great account of himself there. I don't know if he was even feeling that great that day. I often wondered, because he's not going to say that much post-match, and he's not going to make excuses. But I feel like as great as Carlos was that day, and he was spectacular, that Novak was just a bit off. Mm-hmm. And but otherwise, you look at the matches he's played, and he bounces right back and beats him in that great Olympic final. And so I think that maybe isn't quite as tricky as Sinner. Sinner might require even just a little bit more thought, in terms of what it takes to break, because it's harder to break him down. I think for Novak, it's just a bit harder to break Sinner down from the baseline, but certainly not impossible.
Yeah, I see it largely the same way. And you brought up Zverev, and that's the next guy I want to talk about, because he wins. He plays 22 tournaments this year. He finishes number 2. He wins the 2 Masters 1000s. He gets the 2 wins over Alcaraz. You look at it, a pretty great season from start to finish. But there's still those question marks deep in the majors again. And now he has Taylor Fritz to contend with in terms of that head-to-head. He's lost the last 4 times, which I find really fascinating, because Fritz can kind of just go backhand to backhand with him, and you get the feeling Taylor is just really, really confident in that matchup now. And then, it's not just Taylor. You look at, like, Medvedev has won 11 of his last 13 against Zverev. Tsitsipas oftentimes has had his number. Like, there's a lot of hurdles for Zverev to overcome, and yet in his mind, and the improvements that he's made is so clear, and the serving has been so good, and it's like he's got to win a major at some point, but until it actually happens, you can't. It's like one of those things I have to see it to believe it now.
Yeah, he's a very perplexing guy, Vanch. Turn is a good example. I thought he was playing really, really well in the round robin. And he played, and granted, okay, this was not the very best Carlos, but still it was a very impressive performance from Zverev, beating Alcaraz there to go 3-0 in his round robin. And then it's a chance to finally make amends against Taylor for the 3 previous losses. And we get to crunch time, and once again, he plays what I thought was a very disappointing tiebreak. He played two pretty poor tiebreaks against Taylor at the Open. Yeah. So as much as I agree with you about the comfort of the backhand to backhand pattern and how Taylor likes that and is not daunted by it and feels like he can at least hold his own there, some of it is, I think, psychological too, because Zverev had 2 sets to love at Wimbledon and lost in 5. The knee maybe bothered him a bit. And then the Open, he loses 2 of the 3 sets he loses are in tie breaks. And I felt like there were times there he looked like he was ready to turn the corner. And Laver Cup is close. And then Turin, once again, coming right down to the wire. So no doubt it's not a bad matchup for Fritz by any means. In fact, it's a good one. But I don't think I guess what I'm saying, yes, it's a good matchup for Fritz, but it's not a bad matchup for Zverev. So I could see him maybe turning that around, at least getting back into that rivalry in the coming year. I'd be surprised if he played Fritz 3 or 4 more times in 2025. I would certainly, I'd expect Sasha to get a couple of wins in there. But to me, the larger question, and you summed up his record so well, and you summed up his rivalry so well, because although I will say this, you mentioned Medvedev. I think that may change a bit too, unless Daniel suddenly gets a confidence boost early in 2025. He's a bit down on himself now. So I feel like Zverev would do well to meet him. Wouldn't be a bad thing to get another crack at him at the Australian Open. I'm not so sure I wouldn't go with Sasha in that match. But then the question becomes, Vanch, when he plays the big guys and the chips are on the line and it's crunch time and he's under pressure. I mean, to me, Carlos played very well as he had done in the semis against Sinner in Roland Garros, but I felt like the chance was right there. Zverev is a set all, and he comes from 5-2 down to win the 3rd set. Great run to close that set out. And then I really didn't think I was very disappointed in his standard of the last 2 sets. Mm-hmm. And I don't think he made Carlos work hard enough. And I felt like he didn't play like a guy that was saying to himself, I'm 1 set away finally from winning a major. I'm going to do it. This is my time. And I didn't get that from him. And he complained later. I know he said he felt he was a bit tired in the 5th set. His legs were a bit gone, but somehow you have to summit it. And I feel like there's still too many matches get away from him that should not get away from him. Yeah. And that was a golden opportunity, as when we know what happened in the 2020 U.S. Open. We know what happened with the Dominic Thiem and being 2 sets to love up there and a break and then serving for the match in the 5th set and losing that match. So, I mean, he's been so close a couple of times to winning majors. This was definitely his most solid season. No. In that sense, it was good, but he still just came away with a couple of titles, as you mentioned. He probably should have been good for, I would think, for 2 or 3 more titles than he got. So I don't mean to be too critical, but I just wonder, I mean, we know he's going to end next year somewhere around. The upside would be 3. The upside would be 3 if things went extremely well, and he won't be much lower than. He can't be lower than 5 or 6 in my view. He's just going to win too many matches. But the question is he finally going to produce it when it matters the most? Yeah. And he beat the big guys when it really matters. I still doubt him a bit on that. And but next year will be a big one for him. Coming off this campaign, and everything he's been through, he knows he's got to make his move pretty soon here. He doesn't want to let it go into 26 or 27. And that's why I'm fascinated to see, because I do expect, I don't know how you feel, Vanch, I do expect to see Sasha in at least a couple of semis at the majors next year, maybe in another final. Yeah. But the question is, will he get the job done? And can we have less evidence to go on. We haven't seen enough of him and Sinner recently. The Cincinnati final was terrific, and I thought we might get to see him play the Turin final. In that sense, I was kind of hoping he might beat Fritz, because I think he would have given Sinner a much tougher test than Taylor did. Yeah. So, but he played really well against him in Cincinnati, and so I it's not like he can't test any of those top guys, and he gets his wins over Carlos, as we saw this year. Australia, and then of course again in Turin, seems like he, on his best serving days, he's gonna have some wins over Carlos, and so I'll be really interested in his form next year to see if he is finally able to find a way, Vanch, to say, okay, I got to peak for the majors. I did well in Roland Garros, but I didn't do as well as I could have in the rest. Yeah. And obviously the other match, that he let get away gets back to Medvedev. To have him down 2 sets in Australia like he did, and not close that out. It could have been him playing Sinner in the finals. Wow. Very easily could have been playing Sinner there. And who's to say that he doesn't win that? Who knows? He would have been right in there, but he's denied himself some pretty big prizes with some of these and in not closing out. I mean, when you lose 2 majors, I mean, 2 of the losses to Medvedev and Fritz last year were from 2 sets to love at the majors. The Carlos loss was from 2 sets to 1 up. And then the Taylor loss, granted, in 4 sets, but 2 of them in breakers. So you add all that up, you look at the 4 losses at the majors, and you shake your head a bit about Zverev's capacity to bring out his best when the stakes are highest.
Yeah, I have big questions about, like, can he actually produce it at 5-0 in the 4th and the 5th, and really big moments, and and it's it's a little bit different with Medvedev, but kind of similar as well, where it's like, he hasn't won a title in over 18 months, and he clearly has he clearly can't beat Sinner right now, unless something dramatically changes, and then pretty much the same with Carlos, even though he did get those 2 wins in majors that we've talked about, but those feel like just anomalies. But Daniil, and he's also talking a lot about the balls and everything, and I know he's such a smart guy, and he can take pressure off himself, and I won't be surprised if we see a little bit better results from him most of next year, just because he tends to kind of do that. Like, he tends to kind of fluctuate in terms of his seasons. Like, you'll have one kind of an off season like this, and then he'll suddenly surprise us again. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see him, like, suddenly right back in the mix. Maybe it won't even happen in Australia. Maybe it'll happen, in the tournaments between. Maybe before Indian Wells or Miami. But I could see something like that again. So it would just be, he's so hard to predict.
You know what? This is interesting, because you and I almost always see eye to eye on these things. We're almost always on the same page. With Medvedev, I'm a bit more circumspect. I'm a bit more worried about him, in the sense that, as you said, it's been over 18 months since he took us out of Rome in 23.
Yeah.
And that weighs on his mind. Then the cumulative losses to Sinner. Sinner going from being 6-0 against the guy, now he has the 1 win at Wimbledon, which is a bit tainted. That's not fair. You certainly look at it from our standpoint and wonder, if Sinner had been healthy, does that match turn out differently? Still a nice performance from Daniel, but isolated. Just like the 1 win recently over Carlos was a very good performance from Medvedev at the 23 Open in the semis, but you look at all the other matches and it's all Carlos. So I worry about those 2 guys a lot against him.
Yeah.
I think a revitalized Novak, I still take him to beat Daniel. Granted, he does like playing Zverev, but as I say, I think Zverev might be ready to start doing a bit better against him. And then there's just all of the other guys in the middle pack.
Yeah.
There's so many more guys, the De Minaurs, the Fritzes. There are a lot of guys that on their day are going to beat Daniel too. So I worry, and as we've talked about too, I worry about, is the serve ever going to be quite as good as it was? Is that shoulder? We get these reports about his shoulder. It's hard to know how serious that is, but it makes me think, Vanch, going back to that period of the Daniel of 19 through 22, well, especially 19 through 21, but during that period, I felt like he could really call on that serve, that big first serve, to come through for him on a count. I thought it was a big factor in beating Novak in the U.S. Open final, his 1 major. And I feel like the last, especially this past year, but to some extent even the year before, but that the serve has not been as consistently potent for him or as productive as he'd like it to be. And that I start to think that matters more and more, because he has to work so hard to win those points from the baseline. He tries to add that layer of aggression. Sometimes he get, like when he in turn, he tried to do that a bit against Sinner. You saw him trying to pick it up a bit, pick up the pace a bit, take a few more chances. Then he makes a few more errors. but I feel like there's a lot of wear and tear from the baseline with Daniel, and therefore he could use those more free points than he's getting on serve. So that's my other concern. My concern is we might see Medvedev in 2025 slip down. I mean, he's not going to disappear from the top 10 because he's just going to win too many matches, but we might see him go down somewhere to like, anywhere between 6 and 8 in the world. That wouldn't shock me, because the other guys are going to keep plugging away, and Fritz is going to keep winning a lot, and he's got a lot of pride about getting to 4, and Sasha's got a lot of pride in ending the year at 2. And so Daniel, it's going to be a big effort to climb back to get any higher than 5 where he is right now. But I think he might go down into the 6 to 8 range. That's my fear. I kind of hope I'm wrong. I'd rather see him. I don't like to see a great player declining in his late 20s like that. I'd like to see him still playing more peak level tennis. But either way, Vanch, I think where we'd agree is that the coming year is going to be a big one for him too. After what's happened the last year and a half, he really wants to get back in there and feel like he's right in there with the big guys, and that he's at least he's at least playing for these titles. He's at least in the semis and finals of majors, being very competitive. But my concern is that Carlos seems to have him completely confounded, and it's almost in his mind. Some of the comments he makes after these matches, it's almost like in his mind he's now saying, the guy's just better than I am. He's too good. And he feels that way to maybe slightly lesser extent. He feels that way about Sinner too.
Oh yeah, no, definitely, and I agree with all the points. And the serving has been worrying, because you can look at. I've been looking at all of his stats, and like he's below average, like below tour average in the serve, and it shows. Like, so many double faults in many of these matches, big moments, big chunks, and it affects the rest of his game mentally as well. And there's a lot of other guys apart from Alcaraz and Sinner, but he doesn't play too many 250s and 500s, so he's not winning any titles. And so then he's coming up against Sinner and Alcaraz, or he's getting picked off by other guys, before the semis and finals. And so it feels like the title drought just continues. But I wonder if he does go back and play a couple of more of those smaller tournaments, like post Australia, and just get some form going. That's when I think we could see Daniil, like when he gets into those, he starts going on those like 15, 20 match win streaks. And granted, he doesn't maybe he catches one of these guys at the right time. I could see something like that happening for him, where like all of a sudden then he's in a little bit of a better place. But I think consistently, I think none of that matters for his legacy. It's all about getting that second slam.
Oh yeah,
so that he's gonna,
it is.
The titles are not going to make a difference there. It's more about just like feeling better about himself and confidence.
Yeah, but your point's well taken, because if he does grab a 250 here and a 500 there, then just the feeling of winning any title can help. And he hasn't had that feeling for far too long right now. And there's where you can get a bit of a carryover effect into the 1000s and the slams, where it becomes a habit again. All those guys talk about the habit of winning, and we
saw that in 2023, right? After he lost to Korda at the Australian Open, and he dropped outside the top 10. Then we saw him pick up those titles in Doha, Dubai, and he beat Djokovic along the way. But Djokovic wasn't right in that semi. But still, I mean, he gets that win, and then he loses to Carlos at Indian Wells, and then he wins Miami. So it's like he won a little bit of a roll there. He won like 5 titles in 3 months, and then kind of since then is what we're
I think that's going to be. That was a good kind of recovery period. I think that's going to be harder for him to achieve, to replicate that now will be harder.
Yeah.
But at least if he just get a title or 2 in there, then he might come into these majors feeling better. And then obviously you never know when he's going to get a break with the draw. Yeah. And Carlos has that bad day against somebody else, and maybe it's Zverev again, and then Medvedev feels like he's got an opening. But it's going to take. He's definitely going to need those kinds of good breaks. And what I admire about him, Vanch, is that he's one of the most honest guys out there in the press conferences. He really doesn't. He really tells you exactly. He comes clean. He tells you exactly what he's feeling. He tells you what his concerns are. He's not at all guarded, which I think is the most likable part of him. But that's one part of the equation. The other part is that when he's out there, he's sometimes imploding.
Yeah.
And he said coming into this year, he was going to try to cut that stuff out, but he didn't really succeed. And that's also important. And you mentioned the doubles, and I think sometimes the doubles come about out of confusion of, should I really go for the big second serve? or just kick it in deep, and then he can get into trouble when he goes for the bigger one and he'll miss it. And some of that, it's head stuff to me. He could definitely reduce those number of doubles if he was calmer. I honestly think that's getting frazzled, that's getting perturbed, and he's almost talking himself into it at times. So that's that he has control over that. He can't control when Carlos hits a perfect drop shot winner and catches him on his heels. There are times like that you have to live with, but he can control more of what happens in his own service games, stopping the double faults, getting more first serves in, and hopefully picking up the velocity 2 or 3 more miles an hour on that first serve. I want to see him more often in the high 120s.
Yeah, for sure. And there's so many matchups that I would just like to see next year that I feel like didn't pan out this year, with like Zverev and Sinner, Zverev and Djokovic,
Yeah.
I want to see Fritz and Medvedev play again, for instance.
Yeah.
It's just fascinating. I hope we see many, many matches between these 6. Frankly, I hope that's the top 6 next year at the end.
Yeah, I think very likely. And yeah, hopefully we will get a lot of matches. Like, those are all very appealing matchups, and those are, you can't go wrong matchups. So I hope they play out.
Because Taylor is interesting as well, because he's put himself right at number 4, and yet I just feel like he's still so far away from Sinner, Alcaraz, and Djokovic. But on the right days, he can beat Zverev. He can even beat Medvedev now. He can beat a lot of the other players that he wasn't beating before. And in some ways, it was just a spectacular year from him. So,
Yeah. No, listen. If you told him coming into the year, you know what, Taylor, you're going to get to your first Slam final, you're going to get to your first Turin final, and you're going to finish the year 4 in the world, he would have smiled and said he would take it. And the question's going to be, can he hold that ground? I have no doubt he stays in the top 10. I'd be shocked if he didn't stay in the top 10, because he plays a lot. He wins too much. His game has too much to offer. Mm-hmm. Great first serve, tremendous backhand. Forehand can be a bit in and out, but I thought this year he solidified it. I thought the only time the forehand let him down badly was Musetti at Wimbledon. I thought he made a rash of errors over on court 1 in that match. And it surprised me that he lost that at Wimbledon quarter against Musetti. And the forehand to me was the main reason why. But otherwise, I like the way he's hitting the forehand. The backhand is beautiful. This first serve is great. And he's a good competitor. But you're right. You put your finger on it. I mean, look, in the Novak match, that was kind of symbolic of a lot of the others. It sort of reflected a lot of the other. He plays well. He plays it tight. He's got a chance. But in the end, he loses 4 and 6. Or in Sinner, he's going to lose 4 and 4, 3 and 4, 3, 4 and 5. And Carlos, kind of similar, the way Carlos beat him in the Laver Cup. I don't think too much is going to change in that regard. I mean, Taylor would argue that with us. If he were sitting here now, he'd say, I honestly think he'd say respectfully, you guys don't know what you're talking about. But the evidence, to me, indicates that he may not be able to solve them. But all the other guys below him, he's 4 in the world, and any of the other guys, he'll hold his own with Medvedev, and and obviously he's shown in the case of the guys above him. We'll see what happens as he goes forward with Zverev, but great year against Zverev this year, and then you could just keep going down the list, and people like Casper, Ruud, he can beat any of these guys. So I say that Taylor, maybe he doesn't stay at 4, but and obviously Novak, depending on how much he plays, he's going to be right back in there. But I do think that Fritz can stay, will finish the year. My guess for him, Bonch, is somewhere between 5, 6, or 7. Most likely 5 or 6, somewhere in there, because he worked hard to get there, and he's in no hurry to leave that territory.
Yeah, I mean, there's also other guys, like obviously Casper Ruud is just he has a spectacular first half of the year, and then from basically Roland Garros to the ATP finals, he kind of ever since he had that stomach problem against Zverev in the first set.
Yeah.
At Roland Garros, he never really recovered from that, and you can see him sometimes go on these. We tend to think of Casper kind of in the way he's framed. It's almost like, he's a very consistent 5 through 8 guy who's showing in and week out and can't beat the best. But in reality, he was 6-4 against the top 10 this year, but he just went through streaks of like not winning any matches, and he can do that sometimes. Like he can just go 3-4 months.
Well, yeah, terrible. He's lost
win,
like 9 out of 11 matches. Before Turin, and that was a nice recovery there. And you're right, he can get a bit down on himself, I think, too. Now, maybe, hopefully, same thing with FAA. Getting engaged, maybe that can be a nice moment in a man's life, and maybe that will just help him to keep things in perspective. Because I think there are times you really feel like he's his own worst critic. I don't want to say his own worst enemy, but he's very self-critical, and not necessarily on the court, but when you hear his comments afterwards, it's almost like there are times I believe he sells himself a bit short. So I hope next year that, he can, I would think that he can get better results next year post Roland Garros. And you're right. Also, there was more than one instance of illness too. He had a couple, didn't he? So health-wise, it was not a great year.
No, but he managed to make some of it at the end, and he gets out of the group and he makes the year-end finals semis for like the third time out of 3. So that's that's a good way to kind of salvage that drought that he had. But and then you have Rublev, who's either finishing 8 or 5 every single year since 2020, and this was the season that he finishes 8th because he gets the 2 big results in Madrid and Canada, but then he still continues to have these like psychological problems, and he's his own worst enemy on the court. So that's
he is. Obviously, he gets frenzied out there, and nobody gets angrier. Nobody vents more than him. But he's a workhorse too. I feel like he's one of these guys who's going to play and play and play, and he's one of these guys that could lose 3 straight first rounders, and then the 4th week come back and win the tournament. So he'll keep his ranking up there, at a decent level. But I wouldn't want to be leaving our position as analysts and journalists and people that report on the game and being a fan and being a Rublev fan. I think you'd go gray very quickly.
Yeah.
And it must be wrenching to watch him if you're on his side.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll see what he can produce next year, but I think we kind of know what to expect when it comes to Andrey, and I suspect he'll have another top 10 finish. But then you look at. I want to ask you this: amongst these 3 guys, amongst Holger Rune, Jack Draper, and Arthur Fils, who do you think will have the best 2025? It's a good question.
Right, sure. You're so right. I don't know quite what to expect from Holger. I certainly expected a much better 2024 than we got. I think he'll improve on that. Will he get back to where he was in 23? It'll be somewhere in between, but I think he'll be closer to the 23 version of himself, I hope. Draper, I'm very encouraged about. I was really impressed with his U.S. Open, and I feel like with that left-handed serve of his, I think he's a big threat a lot of places, including Wimbledon.
Yeah.
So I expect a big, big year from him. And Fils, of the 3, I'm really excited about Fils. I mean, long term, I'm excited about Draper because I think, he's one of these guys that is going to be. I don't think he's going to win Wimbledon, but I think he's going to be a big threat there, and I don't think he's afraid of those occasions. I like what he showed us at the Open. Played a good match against Sinner in the semis. I'm encouraged about Jack being. I see him going for a low top 10 spot. Next year, somewhere 8 to 10 in the world, and Fils, I think, might climb in there himself. I like Fils a lot. He's a very emotional player. I think he's a really terrific all-around player. He's got a lot of strengths, and I feel like very ambitious. And he improved to me significantly in 2024. So I feel like Fils. I think Fils and Draper are going to have great years. I think Rune is going to have a good year.
Yeah, I see it largely the same. And Rune finished his 13th, and he had a few good results like Cincy and Paris, and other times where he went out there and just lost 1-1 or 0-2 against guys that you just when he's on shouldn't be anywhere near him. And then so he has a lot of those dips, and I don't think he's
you have a match sorry to interrupt. You make me think of like the Nakashima match at the Open.
Yeah,
where
yeah, matches like that, which are just
that you just shake your head. I mean, you wouldn't be upset with him if he lost 6-4 in the fifth to Nakashima on a really
right.
good Nakashima, but it was routine. So, yeah, he's perplexing that way. I hope there's going to be a lot less of that this coming year. I sometimes wonder whether physically he's at times ailing and we don't even know it.
I think so. I think a lot of
yeah.
the games. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's going to be interesting. And Feast, I've been very impressed by the two 500s that he won this year because,
Yeah.
the match that he won against Zverev in Hamburg was top quality, and he saved like 21 out of 22 break points.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
the
that was
whole
a
run
great
that he
match.
went on in Tokyo was just insane when he beat like Rune and Shelton and Fritz,
Yeah.
Berrettini.
No, those were two great efforts, and there's no reason it couldn't lead him toward winning a 1,000 this coming year. You know, the guys they know how good he is. And the Zverev match was a very, very mature performance, and Sasha was fighting hard that day. So, yeah, very impressive.
Yeah. I gotta say another person that was on my mind is Shelton because I mean, whenever we talk about like which American can win a slam, he's always number one in that discussion because we always think like, okay, his upside must be huge, which it is because of the, like you feel like he can still improve his spot serving. He can definitely get, his return can get way better, and there's so many parts of his game that can improve. And we always ask like who's going to finish top American, and it's always been Fritz like the last 4 years. And
Yeah.
I just wonder if he's any close or anywhere near because I feel like he didn't have the highs that he had last year, and we saw a lot of like third round, fourth rounds from Shelton.
Yeah.
And he
Yeah.
finished outside the top 20, and he only had one top 10 win outside, one top 20 win outside of the Labour Cup all year. That was against Rublev in Basel. So I kind of wonder where he goes from here. It's still very early, but I don't think he'll make the top 10 next year. I feel like he'll be somewhere around 15.
Yeah, that's a good guess. That's a good guess. I will say this. I honestly think despite all the evidence you just presented and the facts, I felt like he improved. I feel like,
I felt like his floor got better. His average, like week in and week out level got way better.
Yeah, and I think his forehand is more reliable, and I still think the serve, it's a great serve, but it could be, he should be harder to break. When you can serve in the 140s like he can, but mix it up and the heavy kickers and the wide slice and the left-handedness, I mean, it's all there. A lot of advantages. For a guy of that ability, he shouldn't get broken. I think that's going to change some next year. And I feel like you take a match, you look at something like the Tiafoe match at the Open. I thought it was a great match. It was one of the best matches of the Open. And if Ben wins that, who knows where, what happens from there. Maybe he's in the semis. Maybe he goes on to the semis and plays Taylor in the semis. So I feel like he's not that. It's like what you were saying about Novak not being that far from where he'd been the year before, that he's still winning 80% of his match. I feel like Shelton is very close to it. And I almost felt like he took everything in the right light this year. He accepted the fact that guys were going to be gunning for him. He'd made his big breakthrough in 23, with that great, with the Australian at the start, and then especially at the U.S. Open to get to the semis. And I feel like he accepted the fact that guys were going to be gunning for him this year, but he also was looking to learn as much as he could. So I expect him, maybe I'll put him up to 12 next year, maybe a little higher than 15. I agree that 10 would be a big leap, and I don't know if he can quite pull that off, but I expect to see some strides made there from him. And I liked his attitude. He took his losses well, and he had good things to say when the matches were over. And I feel like he's chalking everything up and figuring it out. And I think his father is a great influence on him. I think his father is very smart and reasonable, and not. I don't feel like his father is coming down on him hard after that. We can't know what they're saying behind the closed doors, but I suspect he's been very positive and very encouraging. So I feel pretty good about Shelton for next year.
Yeah. He's certainly someone that I could see having his best season 2 or 3 years from now. And it's kind of, at 25, 26, I think we'll really see him peaking.
Yeah, and at that stage, I like to believe he's going to get through a lot more matches without losing the serve. I just feel like he's the kind of player that should be capable of that. And that should be the anchor of his game. And it can be dazzling at times, for short periods, but he's got to be able to keep, bailing himself out from break point down and not allowing himself to be broken. And he's good by 2027, I think we should be seeing that, and maybe even in 2026.
Yeah. I guess where I want to end this is I want to talk a little bit about the players who left the game, and obviously the biggest one is none other than Mr. Rafael Nadal, who said goodbye at the Davis Cup. What were your thoughts on kind of how the Davis Cup went for Spain and how challenging that was for Ferrer to kind of, focus on Spain, giving Spain the best chance of winning, but also giving Rafa the farewell that he deserves.
Yeah, I think Ferrer had to let Rafa play. I don't think Rafa pressured him in any way, but it just wouldn't have seemed right if he didn't give him the crack. And you could never know if Rafa might do something stunning, and suddenly it's best of 3 sets, and maybe he can summon it even despite all that time off since the Olympics. And then obviously that put Spain, when he lost, that put them in a real bind, and Carlos couldn't quite do it in the doubles. They were up against a better team. But as far as Rafa, look, I mean, he came into the year saying this was going to be it. He saw it as not strictly a farewell tour, but he knew that this was going to be it. And he played as much as he could and gave it a real effort to get ready. That string of tournaments he played on the clay, he was never at his best, but he was trying like crazy to be ready for Roland Garros, and he gets a terrible draw to play Zverev. Not that I think he would have gone beyond the 16s or quarters anyway. Mm-hmm. But I feel like it was a chance for him to confirm for himself that it was time to go, that his body is not going to cooperate. He saw that in the Olympics. Even there, he could have easily lost 1-1 to Novak, or 1-2, and he made a go of that in the second set. And at least he made it competitive in the Olympics to lose to him there, to losing to Novak at 1-4. And yeah. Look, I think I'm glad he's getting out of there. I just feel like he couldn't put his body through any more than he has. It really goes back, Vance, as you know, it really goes back to 2021, where he's missing that whole second half of the year after that great match with Djokovic at the French was pretty much a wipeout, and he tried to play on the hard, and it was a disaster. Basically, missed Wimbledon, barely played the second half. Tried on the hard courts, didn't go anywhere. Then he comes back and wins those 2 majors to start off 22, which was amazing, especially Australia. But again, he was hurting a lot after that. And you look at everything that's happened since, and I think he did very well to make it this far, to stretch it this long. Yeah. So I feel like he should feel good about it. He should be particularly happy, by the way, if he looks back over that period, that he was able to salvage those last 2 majors, because he was in terrible, not even just coming into Australia cold in 22 and playing 1-2-50 to get himself ready and winning it, and then to come from 2 sets down and 2-3 love 40 in the third against Medvedev, win that final. And then the French, where he had the whole thing with the foot, getting the injections in his foot before every match, which we didn't know until after the final, and playing on a foot that was largely numb. I don't think it was entirely numb, but it was pretty numb. To get those 2, I think he'll be really proud of that when he starts looking back on the latter stages of his career, because, that it was just physically, it was getting to be more and more challenging. And there were just too many things going wrong with his body. But look, I was rewatching the other night, the 2009 Australia, when Rafa beat Roger. The tennis channel was showing it. So I watched it, and Martina Navratilova was talking about, saying what everybody said at that time. They were projecting then, could he eventually pass Roger in majors? That's when he was kind of that's when he was dominating Roger, because he'd beaten him in the French and Wimbledon the year before, and now he beats him in Australia for his first Australian. And they were speculating about his career, what he might eventually accomplish. And Martina was saying what everybody said at that time. We just don't know how long, how long will he last? How long will his body be able to take this? It's so punishing for him. Everybody hoping. And Rafa himself, in the early stages of his career, basically saying that the gist of it was, if I can play up till 30, that he'd be very happy to play up till 30. He knew what a taxing, debilitating style of play he had. And the fact that he goes all the way up to 38 is pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's astonishing.
And then, then there's the history part. The fact that,
yeah,
he fell short of Novak, but he did pass Roger, which took, that was it. People don't realize what a great accomplishment that was in its own right. And just there's too much emphasis put on Novak passing, which is to Novak's, that's the Novak story. That's the Djokovic greatness and what he's done to cement his place in history. But Rafa, what he had to do to come from so far back against Roger and eventually win two more than Roger was a remarkable accomplishment. And that's despite Roger beating Rafa 6 of the last 7 times they played.
Yeah.
In the latter years, especially devastating with 17 when Rafa had that 3-1 lead in the 5th against Roger in the Australian final, and Roger came back. And then Roger proceeded to beat Rafa pretty soundly in both in Indian Wells, Miami, and then in China at the end of the year. They were all straight set matches, and I don't think he got broken in any of them. I think it was 6 straight sets of not getting broken, and at most 1 break. So it's like that was a tough stage for Rafa, but typical of him, he still split the 4 majors with Roger in 17, and he just kept on going there. He had those very dry 15 and 16 years, which didn't go well for him. He wasn't that, physically he was struggling. And even in 14, when he won the French, he had some injuries that were troubling him. But then I thought what he did in 17, 18, 19, 20 was pretty remarkable. And then a little icing on the cake in 22.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think we have to tip our hat to him bunch for how his game kind of evolved under Moya, and they put more emphasis on getting a little more bite on that first serve, changing the toss, leaning into it more, and he started to get more free points on his serve, which he needed at that stage of his career. And he started to step inside the baseline more. We saw him playing a more aggressive tennis, particularly on surfaces other than clay. I mean, but even transferred it to the clay. And I thought he kind of dealt with the demands of his age, that the Rafa in his 30s was not going to be able to cover the court the way he had in his late teens up to his mid-20s. And he found a way to address that. And I think Moya deserves a lot of credit, because as great as Uncle Tony was in the early years, and Tony was remarkable with how he guided him and how he helped him to stay humble and all the things he did to develop his game. I think that Moya's role was pretty crucial in the latter stages of helping Rafa to navigate those years.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that he won 8 more in his 30s.
Incredible. Incredible. Yeah.
And I feel like of all the big 3 records, the hardest one to break is still going to be the 14.
Oh, yeah.
I just don't think anyone will break that in this.
No, because
as long as I'm alive.
How many prime years do you have to do it? And it's just, I don't think anybody will come close to that. I think it's incredible that Novak would win 10 Australian, and maybe he can add another to that next year, but 14 is ridiculous. And even though there was a bigger gap between Rafa on clay and any of his rivals than you could say about Novak on hard or Roger in his prime on hard or grass. The gap was the widest with Rafa and the field on clay. But nevertheless, Vanch, you're still going to have to get through some tough semis and finals. You're still playing great players in the latter stages, or you have an Isner on a given day, as he did, taking you to 5 on the clay there. It was still, I just don't think you can take away from him. And then there's always the ability, even as great as Rafa is, you might choke 1 or 2 away. He didn't do that.
No.
He absolutely didn't do that. So it's 14 titles, but it's also the losses. He lost to Novak in a quarter, and he loses to Novak in a semi, and Soderling got him in the round of 16. Nobody beat him in a final. Nobody even beat him in a semi.
Yeah.
So that's what impresses me the most, is that those guys were playing well. The people he's coming up against, all the matches with Novak there, 10 matches at Roland Garros, and Novak wins 2 at the French Open, that is. And it's like, okay. And the 5 finals with Roger. And Roger was at that stage. I mean, Roger and Novak both. First, Roger in the earlier years was the second best clay court player, and then Novak took over that role later. And Rafa kept dealing with them. So I just feel like that accomplishment should not be minimized. The people shouldn't just say, okay, well, he just was so much better than everybody on clay, no problem. No, there's still problems. There's still challenges. There's still difficulties. And he just was, he just kept rising to the occasion, and I think he was amazed when he got to 5, 6, or 7, but he just kept it going. And that run, again, he had squeezed through the 14 final against Novak from a set down. And then in 15 and 16, he loses to Novak in 15. He has to pull out with an injury in 16. But then what he did to take it over again from 17, 18, 19, 20, where he crushed Novak in the final. And then he loses to Novak and then comes back and wins it again in 22. I mean, that's astounding to think that what he did at that stage of his career, winning those last 5, as you say, in his 30s. And Novak has got 12 majors in his 30s, but Rafa to be winning 8 in his 30s is actually surprises me more than Novak winning 12.
Yeah, definitely. The fact that he had 63 titles on clay and 51 losses is just absurd.
Yeah.
6 of those 51 are this year. So it's like.
And look, where we have to give him his due, though, is, okay, look, there's no question. I mean, it's not even an argument. You can't even put Bjorn into the argument of greatest clay court player of all time. But where Rafa will be even more proud is that he managed to get 4 U.S. Opens, 2 Wimbledons, and 2 Australian. And all those Masters 1000s. He had years like 2013 where he won Indian Wells, Canada, Cincinnati, U.S. Open, all on hard. Yeah. Some of these were not easy things for him to accomplish, and yet he did. So I think in some ways that probably means as much, if not more, to him, to sort of show the world, look, don't just talk about me as a clay court player. Don't go overboard with your praise of my 14 French. I'm very proud of it, but don't forget what else I did. I think it meant a great deal to him.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, the only drawback, Vanch, is the only way, I hate to be at all critical like this, but he wasn't able to make it happen indoors.
Yeah,
he had a bad tour, and he never won the tour, the ATP finals, as much as he tried. And I know that he and Uncle Tony used to say in the early years, "Why can't this be on clay?" And that was never practical because the end of the year, nobody's playing on clay at the end of the year, except the odd Davis Cup. So I mean, and even then, it rarely happens. So I just feel like that was not realistic. He just had to find a way to get it done. And with the changes he made in his game in the later years, it maybe could have happened. He got better in fast conditions, but
I think 2020 is the one he'll look back at, that match against Medvedev when he served for it in the semis.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. It could have been
that's the one.
Yeah. He had it serving for a straight set win. That's true. Who's to know if he wins the final?
Hard to know, but no Roger and Novak that year.
Yeah, so. No, the chance was there. You're right, but it just didn't happen for him. Look, it's a minor blemish in his record. It really is. I mean, especially when you weigh that up against 4 U.S. Opens and 2 Australian and all the other 1000s on hard. So, but looking back, I'm a bit surprised because I have so much respect for his ability to compete. Best day in, day out competitor that we ever saw, because it just never let his guard down. While Novak had moments and matches and times where he was vulnerable, but then he became increasingly the best player under pressure that we could ever see. But Rafa, it was just always steady, and he always competed with sort of an equanimity and a level-headedness, very level-headed the way he competed. Oh. He kept his emotions under control. So as I'm saying, given those attributes, I'm a bit surprised retrospectively that he didn't will his way. Like the Medvedev, that would have been the perfect opportunity to get himself in the final and win it then, because he didn't sell himself short. He was honest about his challenges, and yet he also went out there fully intending to win all those matches and never going in saying, I can't win this tournament. So looking back, I'm surprised it didn't happen. Like 2010, I thought he lost in Roger in 3 sets in the final. Yeah. I thought that was one of his great years because he won the French, Wimbledon, U.S. Open back-to-back, Botch. You remember how great he was there in 2010. He got his French Open title back. He avenged the loss to Soderling from the year before. And then he wins his second Wimbledon. over Berdych 2 years after his first, and then he gets the U.S. Open for the first time, beating Djokovic in the final. So I thought when he came into that final at the end of that year, I really thought he was going to do it that year. I honestly did. Didn't happen.
Yeah, didn't happen. He had that really long semi with Murray and then that took so much out of him.
Yeah, that's true.
And then
the Murray match was a great match. But I thought again, he spoiled us because he was so resilient and so able to recover. And I just thought he was riding so high at that stage, having won the last 3 majors. But obviously for him, the biggest challenge of those years up till that point was beating Roger indoors. And, later then as the decade progressed, the biggest challenge became beating Djokovic on hard courts, although he did do it notably in that 2013 U.S. Open final. And also, he beat Novak in the 2010 final too. Mm. But I just feel like, for a long time there, Roger indoors was kind of a nightmare for Rafa. So I get it. But I think the Roger of 2010 was not as daunting as the Roger of 2004 through 2008. So it was probably the best possible time for him to play him. And he just wasn't quite good enough to get it done. But bad luck, but he got close.
You know how many people always talk about the 2019 Wimbledon final and the forehand pass that Djokovic hits on the match point. But the more I think about it, I think the more defining one is the forehand that he hit against Rafa in 2018 in the semis. Because I think that just changes, that changes if Djokovic doesn't pull that off there. I mean, then now Rafa has 3 Wimbledons and
think about it.
Plays out and it's just
you're right. I mean, think about it. It's 7-all. It's 7-all, 15-40 for Novak. So it was a huge point. And it's funny because Rafa approached cross court, but he hit it pretty well.
It was better than the Roger forehand inside in, I think. But it's just,
exactly. But what I'm saying is he hit the approach pretty well. Yeah. But Novak was pretty poised to make that pass. Mm-hmm. And you're right. That was a huge match because it's a semifinal that was really a final. Yeah. Because of the marathon match that Isner played, Isner losing to Kevin Anderson. Neither one of those guys was going to come out of that match and beat the winner of Rafa versus Novak. So, that was a hugely consequential match. And that pass that you mentioned was very big. And Rafa got asked about the approach afterwards, should you come in down the line? And he wasn't buying it. Mm-hmm. He just was not buying it. He felt like that was the decision he made, and he wasn't gonna question himself on that. Yeah. But it was a great pass. It was a great pass, and similar. I don't know if I'm putting the match point pass that far behind it because obviously he doesn't make that pass against Roger, and Roger's won Wimbledon.
Yeah, absolutely. But those 2 forehands from Djokovic and some of those shots that he would pull off from match points down against Roger.
The Djokovic forehand return against Roger, the double match point down in the 2011 U.S. semis was, that incredible return. I think that there was a question where he read the serve. I think he really read it. Roger had been going wide in that deuce court a lot, and Novak decided pretty much commit to that. And the serve didn't break as wide as some of Roger's other ones had, and then Novak just got a hold of that return and nailed it. Yeah, those are forehands he will never forget.
Yeah, I mean, another guy who just didn't win the ATP finals was Thiem, and he came so close. And he's another one that you just think. I mean, you watched him play this year, and you're just like, it's good that he recognizes that it's kind of time to leave. And I feel really badly for him because he just wasn't able to have a proper go of it. Post 2021, and he just never was the same player again with the forehand. And you would see flashes every now and then, and he could still hit tremendous backhands down the line. And there were some spells of like vintage Thiem, but it was just such a struggle for him to be a relevant player anymore at the highest level.
Yeah, it was. Listen, I felt like he played some great finals, and I actually think the level that he played against Novak in the 2020 Australian was pretty remarkable. That 5-setter that he lost to Novak in Australia was a great performance from Thiem. That where he went unrewarded because he had 2-1 and Novak came back and beat him in 5. But it was a tremendous performance from Thiem. He was knocking the cover off the ball that match, off both sides. But you're right. As the years progressed, the forehand lost. He lost just a 10, 15%, whatever it was. It was never as explosive as it had once been, and that was taking away it was taking away a singular weapon. But he was great to watch. He was just tremendous to watch.
Yeah, and his record against the big three, at some moments was just staggering. So he'll always have that to kind of look back on, and that's definitely going to be something, that'll define his legacy. And I guess with Andy, we already kind of touched on it, but it'll be interesting to see how that partnership with Djokovic looks like. And I think we're excited. I'm excited for the 2025 because there's just so many great storylines and matchups, and I just feel like it's going to be an even better year than we had this year.
I think so. I mean, look, I think that Australia right off the bat is going to be spectacular because that'll be the start of the Murray, hopefully the start of a long union through the year for Murray and Djokovic because they've announced it through Australia, but I'm hoping that that's just the way they're setting it up initially, and I hope they stay together through the year. But yeah, Australia, I'm sure will get us off to a great, great start. And look, let's just hope. We're also going to know pretty soon to get back to the beginning of our podcast, about whether Sinner is playing in Australia or not. And again, that's what's cool about the process is he's obviously going to be starting some pretty serious preparations soon to get ready for that tournament. And yet waiting day by day, week by week for the announcement and wanting to be cleared. But in any case, beyond that, Carlos has never done anything over there yet, and Carlos may be overdue. But I worry a bit, Avanch. I don't know how you feel. I'm not wild about Carlos playing these exhibitions now. I'm really happy for the fans in Madison Square Garden to see him, and then he's going to play one more after that. But I feel like this is the time when he should be kicking back a bit, or it's not ideal to be playing December exhibitions with the Australian coming up in January. And I don't think it'll help his chances. He could prove me totally wrong, but I'm not wild about him doing it. And I gather that Ruud and Rune have been playing some exos too.
Yeah.
And I don't get that. I mean, I suppose the money sometimes is just too much to pass up. But in Carlos's case, I would think he really would want to come in fresh and ready and confident and, all guns blazing when he comes into Australia. And it just, he's had to miss it a couple of years ago. And then he had the match with Zverev this past year where things didn't go too well for him. And he eventually lost in 4 after getting blitzed the first 2 sets. And I'm sure, considering that this is a guy that has now won 2 Wimbledons, one French and 1 US, that he'd really like to make a serious go of it in Australia. And I'm not going to count him out. I just wish that I wish that he was not. I wish he was not playing those exos. But let's see how he plays, because he's eager to make his mark in Melbourne.
Yeah, I think hopefully after this, after the Charlotte and I think New York, Madison Square Gardens, wherever these are, I think it's tomorrow. I think after this, I don't think he'll play a warm-up before Australia, and the hope is that then he gets a really good training block. He goes back to the Ferrero Academy. He sort of puts his mind all on Australia, and then
hopefully he will. Hopefully he will. It could be that he gets just enough time to refresh himself a bit, and be ready for that. But look, it's going to be it'll be a great year. There's no doubt about it, and I think we've touched on the guys that are going to make it such a remarkable year.
Yeah, and I actually think the CAS, the water appeal thing, I don't think that's going to come before Australia. I think it's largely going to come after the Australian Open. I heard yesterday or today that it could be any time after the Australian Open until February 11th. So hopefully we'll know by then. But that's a real bummer for Sinner because it's going to have to play through Australia with that in the back of
again, I have to say, there's pros and cons to that. It allows him to go back and defend, but then he still has to wonder what's going to happen. And what I wonder is, why does it take so long? They had a definite opinion to begin with, Vanch. If WADA is saying we don't think it's sufficient that Jannik was lost his ranking points and his prize money from Indian Wells. We say it should be 1 to 2 years. Well, that was based on something. Yeah. That was based on evidence. So why would it take them this long? See, I think the process is not working. That's just far too long. And it's the good news is if that's the case, is that at least we'd be guaranteed to see him playing in Australia. But then, the big announcement would come after that. And let's just say he's won Australia again and they decide to suspend him. What a downer for everybody.
Yeah, then my hope is that at least the suspension won't carry over to Roland Garros, that at least he can play the 4 majors.
Well, that would be if they do a pretty light suspension, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's
they're talking about 1 to 2 years. So I don't know. We'll see how it plays out. But I hadn't heard that. That's interesting. That's interesting because I had thought originally that the idea was they would try to have a decision by the end of this month.
Yeah, I think that certainly would have been better for everyone. But
oh yeah.
But yeah,
any ideas? And do you have any notion why they would need that long to review the evidence?
I wish I knew, but I'm not privy to what goes on behind the curtains when it comes to WADA. There's so much secrecy behind all of this. I wish it was more transparent.
Yeah, agreed. Totally agree.
But yeah, it'll be fun. I mean, Novak is already playing in Brisbane, and he's announced today, so we'll already see that Murray and Djokovic partnership as early as December 29th.
Yeah, that's a very wise move. Very wise move. Again, he needs those matches because it was such an uneven year in terms of when and where he played, and then not playing the end of the year like that in Paris and Turin. He'll benefit. However many matches he can get in Brisbane, and who knows, maybe he takes the title. But it's a good move. I like the thinking.
Yeah, for sure. But Steve, this was an absolute blast, and I think we have so much material as we look ahead to 2025, and we kind of assess where the tour is at. And yeah, it's always fun catching up with you at the end of the year after the U.S. Open, and we get 5 of these in every year, and it's great.
Enjoyed it, Vanch. Enjoyed it a lot, and that was we will pick it up again after Australia, after the Australian Open.
Yeah, I can't wait for that one. So we'll see you then.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks.